Hi, everyone. Just first off, I want to thank Anya and Eric for really doing just about everything to get this workshop organized. This would not have come together without them. Um, so I'm going to talk about evolution of virulence during coevolution. And just to give you a little bit of explanation about this talk, I've gotten into this horrible habit of using talks to sort of force progress on projects that I want to work on, but don't really have the time management skills to do without a deadline. And this work is really no exception. And so obviously I'm obsessed with parasites and coevolution, and this example of parasitism is a particularly awesome one. So these cordyceps fungi invade the body of carpenter ants, and they turn them into these basically store-releasing statues that live above the ant's nest, releasing spores to spread into new ants. And they do this by basically controlling the ant, tricking the ant into becoming kind of a zombie, climbing up to the top of a large branch or a blade of grass and kind of clamping down at the end of the blade of grass and just turning into this weird spore-like creature on the left. And the way they do this, we actually can figure out now, and thanks to some really beautiful microscopy, we see these clusters of fungi cells that grow in these kind of filaments, but then even these filaments end up connected to one another through these kind of tubes. And what's cool is that these fungi cells can actually grow into the cell of a muscle, into the muscle cell of the ant. So they're actually bypassing the nervous system and controlling the muscles of the cells, the muscles of the ants themselves. I think this is really cool. But even these really kind of weird zombie parasites can evolve to be potentially mutualists. So cicadas actually multiple times have managed to domesticate this deadly pathogen into a necessary gut microbe that provides them essential nutrients. So this kind of question about how parasites might evolve to become mutualists is one that I'm very interested in. And we don't have a ton of biological evidence sort of how and why parasites evolve to become mutualists, but we do have evidence, at least for bacterial symbionts, that the vast majority of mutualisms did in fact evolve from parasitic ancestors. So if you look at this graph and look at the green tips and trace it back, you usually end up at a red branch. And so that's an instance where a parasite clade gave rise to a mutualistic clade. And so can we see this kind of shift in our Avida host parasite system? Right? But first we need to really decide what mutualism means in Avida, and this isn't an easy problem. So just to remind you, parasites in Avida are implemented with kind of phage in mind. They only replicate within a host. Hosts in Avida are self-replicating computer programs. They perform logic functions. These logic functions allow them access to a single kind of resource in the environment. So each of these tasks, although different, does effectively the same thing. It imports resource from the environment into the organism. But performing tasks also leaves hosts susceptible to infection by parasites. And parasites are also self-replicating computer programs, and they steal a percentage of CPU cycles from their host. And this percentage is what we'll call their virulence. So a parasite that steals 100% of the CPU cycles will completely prevent its host from replicating. It's getting all of that computational energy from its hosts. Whereas one that maybe steals 85% won't necessarily kill the host, although that's still sort of a lot of the CPU cycles that the host would have had otherwise. So it's still costly. It's just not deadly necessarily. Right? So we can think about a mutualism as falling somewhere on the top part of this graph, right? So there's two components to mutualisms. There's cost associated with being invaded by this particular organism and the benefit that you gain by having this organism around. And so you might think of mutualisms as sort of living on the top side of this graph and parasites living on the bottom, right? So how do we define these two different dimensions? Well, we can define the cost of association pretty simply. We've got this virulence level that we've talked about now. But how do we define this benefit? And this one I'm just not sure about yet. So I'm just going to ignore it and just talk about the evolution of virulence in this case, right? So can we move along this one dimension of mutualism, of well, not mutualism, but this one dimension that's important for the evolution of mutualism. It isn't mutualism itself. And so the next few slides might be a little flashy, so look away if you need to. But this is a video of parasites, and in this case, they can evolve the virulence level, but there's no coevolutionary dynamics between the hosts and the parasites. And here we'll see the parasites grow to large abundance, and we'll see the colors kind of get hotter, get more towards this bright white. And then you seem to see this kind of oscillation towards the end where there's, let me see if can I replay? Yeah. There's this oscillation at the end where you kind of see maybe movement of different virulence levels kind of cycling and oscillating. So that's kind of cool, right? And so what happens now when we have coevolution? And we don't see that same sort of explosion of parasite density, and those really fast, really tight oscillations seem to be gone, or maybe they're just diffused over a larger spatial scale. I don't really know what's going on yet, but my first guess is that the combination of patchy populations and this sort of coevolutionary feedback is driving the evolution of local resistance in different hosts, and that's likely to keep the highly virulent parasites at bay. And in part, I think that's because these highly virulent parasites are exerting the strongest selection for resistance, because they're effectively burning through all of the susceptible hosts in at least a local area. And if resistance does evolve in that situation, we might expect it to be costly because it's just whatever survived. And so that resistant host may not be very good, and it probably wouldn't spread very far. Right? And so here's a video that kind of helps paint that same picture, right? It's anecdotal in this case, but I think this is what's going on. So if we allow the hosts now to migrate a little bit, so every time a host gives birth now, instead of just being one of the local neighbors, with some probability, in this case 0.1, that host will pick some random cell in the world to give birth in. And so when we do this, we'll see as the virulent parasite spreads, as you see these white types kind of emerge, it's the whole population kind of pulses. And so the resistant hosts that are evolving in response to these virulent parasites that are perhaps localized are able to spread wider into the population, and kind of you see the whole effect. You see the whole population respond to that effect. Right? But they don't completely take over either. So I think this kind of lends evidence that it is this kind of evolution of resistance, and this kind of costly resistance that is prevented from sweeping through the population. So this is all very preliminary, obviously. So the story is likely to change, but just to kind of recap and show you all of the data in one graph. Here we're seeing the virulence level that evolves when there's no coevolution between hosts and parasites, and when there is coevolution between hosts and parasites, and at 3 different migration rates. I didn't show you the videos for all of these, but I have them. And you see when there's coevolution, we see a much lower level of virulence evolve. And there's a whole lot of noise going on in the coevolution runs, and so if we dig in and look at individual replicates, we actually see that it's actually variation that's occurring within the replicates, not just between them. So even within a single sort of coevolutionary run, there's a lot of different parasite subpopulations that have different levels of virulence that evolve during this coevolutionary process. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions to ask here, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a fun conversation. Thank you.